Cool. So, yeah, I think we can get going now. Yeah, just for for those of you who are new to the project, the Sheffield Wheat Experiment, we're creating spaces for conversation and exploration into wheat, particularly non-commodity population grains. And we are in the third year of distributing seed packs across the city for people to become micro growers of a distributed field of wheat. This year, growing, which began in October 2022, we have nearly 250 micro plots across the city in gardens, allotments, pots, as well as groups such as schools and community organisations. And yeah, so this is the third in a series of talks that we're putting together, and we're going to be hearing from a mix of historians, bakers, musicians, academics, and growers, amongst others, to widen conversations around grains in the context of food diversity, culture, and climate change. And tonight, I'm very happy to introduce Harriet Gendall, who is an ethnobotanical researcher from Cornwall, who does really inspiring work exploring the potential of forgotten foods for revitalising biocultural diversity. And Harriet is currently a PhD student at the University of Kent and Royal Botanic Gardens, Kew. And we're really interested to hear from Harriet about her approach to rediscovering a lost grain. And so I will hand you over now, and Harriet can take us into the world of the lost oat, Pilas.
Thank you, Hannah. Okay, I'll just share my screen. And get this going. Okay, so thank you so much for the invitation to speak, and also thank you so much everyone for joining us tonight. I have to say I feel really kindred sense of spirit with you guys at Sheffield Wheat Experiment, because my journey was also born out of lockdown, just like your project. It was a strange time for everyone, but for all its craziness and all the hardship, and despite the very global nature of the pandemic, it also kind of made space for a questioning of the way that the current system is, and also kind of had that effect of energy being channeled towards the local and the personal, and that's very much what this journey of mine is about. So as Hannah said, I'm Harriet Gendall, and I'm an ethnobotanical researcher, currently doing a PhD at University of Kent and Royal Botanic Gardens, Kew. And ethnobotany, for those of you who don't know, is essentially the study of the relationships between people and plants. So it's actually something really innate to us all, and actually quite simple to connect with once you get your head around it. And Hannah has epically renamed my PhD research Journey for a Lost Oat. And I really have to thank you for that, Hannah, because it's made me rise to the challenge and also helped me reflect on my research as the journey or quest that it quite rightly is. So over the next hour, I'm going to try and take you all with me on that journey. So if you want to grab a tea or a beer or wine, sit back, strap in. And I want us to begin by conjuring up an image in our minds of a picture of some oats. So I'll just give you a couple of seconds to do that. And I'm hazarding a guess that a lot of you will have pictured something a little like this, so kind of like the classic pile of big rolled porridge oats. That's normal. That is what oats generally look like these days, but they also take quite a lot of other forms. And I hope that by the end of this talk, you'll have shifted your perspective somewhat on what the diversity of oats can be, and also on their past significance. So oats are made up of quite a number of different species, and they're thought to have been domesticated quite a bit later than other temperate cereals that also originated in the Near East, like wheat and barley. Oats actually were hitchhikers, so they came to Northern Europe with those crops as weed in the fields, so along with wheat and barley. but they eventually became a really important crop in their own rights. They actually really liked the climate and conditions of Northern Europe. They liked lower nutrient acidic soils and cooler, wetter summers, so they became really widely used on marginal lands across Britain and Ireland as well, but even more so in the wetter western regions, where they embedded very deeply in local culture. And in parts of Ireland, Wales, Scotland, and Western England until really not that long ago, oats were one of, if not the main dietary staple consumed in so many different forms, including those amazing large format oat cakes that you see the lady there in the video, Catherine Evans, making in Wales. They were also really important livestock feed. And oat straw was made use of. It was made into all manner of things: mattresses, baskets, beehives, thatch, even ceremonial headdresses. And oats also appeared in so many folk stories, superstitions, and ritual customs. But this story, this journey, begins with a homecoming in a place far, far away. So far, in fact, that it was described by the Bishop of Exeter in the 14th century as not only the ends of the earth, but the very end of the ends thereof. Cornwall. Cornwall is where I'm from. And when I'm heading home from London or somewhere else up country, as we say in Cornwall, it does sometimes feel like I'm traveling to the ends of the earth, I have to say. But joking aside, I do actually find the bishop's description, although it's a bit far-fetched, actually really useful for setting the geographical and cultural context. So Cornwall in the Middle Ages was considered a distant and foreign place by outsiders, and cartographers as late as the 16th century even considered it as a country in its own right, as you can see in the map on the left there. It was out on a limb geographically. It was also a place where people spoke a different language. So Cornish was already in decline during that time, and even more steeply after the 16th century, following a series of suppressions by the English monarchy. But as a first language, Cornish was actually spoken in some areas of the region until the 1700s. Since the late 19th century, though, there has been an effort to revive lost elements of Cornish culture as well as pride in it. And my granddad, Richard Gendall, known affectionately as Dick, was heavily engaged in the Cornish revival movement. So here he is. He was a linguist, but also a musician. He wrote hundreds of folk songs, quite a lot of them in the Cornish language. Cast your minds back to 2017. I was visiting my granddad and his wife Jan on granddad's 93rd and sadly last birthday. And at the time, I just finished a project where I was working in Peru, documenting farmers' traditional knowledge of an endangered Andean root crop known as malca. And I was explaining this to them, wondering if they were really going to get the gist of it. And actually, it just struck a massive chord with them. And they said, well, didn't you know, Harriet, Cornwall's actually got its own lost crop? Thinking, why is she going over the other side of the world to do this research? And then Jan proceeded to lead me out into the garden, where she showed me a little tiny patch of seedlings. That picture on the right there, that's a bird-proof measure there. So there are seedlings under that grill. She explained to me these were a naked or hull-less oat that was once common in Cornwall, known as pilus. And she then shared a pot of seedlings with me, which over the next few years, my sister Georgia and I grew at her allotment. Jan had shared some historical literature about pilus with me that she collected over the years. And I kept saying to myself, oh, I'm going to make time to sit down and properly read this and do a bit more research on it. But it ended up being one of those things that just stayed on the back burner for quite a few years. Actually, I wasn't living in Cornwall at this time and was mainly focused instead on gearing up for a return to Peru. And I'd managed to secure funding for a PhD in which I would be continuing with the research that I'd begun previously there with farmers and chefs. And I was due to fly out there in April 2020. But as the time approached, I was actually becoming increasingly anxious about my ability as an outsider to tell those farmers' stories. And anyway, there were much, much bigger things happening in the world at that time. And as a result of COVID, I eventually found myself both unable to travel and also back home in Cornwall. So I was advised to begin my Peruvian research remotely, but I was just craving something more local and tangible than that. So I instead began researching Pilus, that thing that Georgia and I were growing at the allotment, the thing that I could reach out and touch, which then led to me looking into the grains movement more widely. And over the course of about 6 months, I'd developed an alternative PhD project based around this. And I just realized there was so much that I could look into here. Around this time, I was also reading Wendell Berry's The World-Ending Fire, and in it I came across this paragraph which struck such a chord with me and with what I was experiencing. So I just want to read it out to you now. Wendell writes, "In coming home and settling on this place, I began to live in my subject, and to learn that living in one's subject is not at all the same as having a subject. To live in the place that is one's subject ceases to be merely emotional or aesthetical, or even merely critical, and becomes problematical, practical, and responsible as well, because it must. It's like marrying your sweetheart." So I married my sweetheart, and my revised doctoral research instead became a practice-led exploration of the opportunities, challenges, and complexities of revitalizing eroded biocultural diversity through the case of Pilus. And the term biocultural diversity basically speaks to the fact that biological diversity and cultural diversity are completely interrelated and codependent, so much so that forging them together in one word allows us to understand and speak to that dynamic more fully. So this exploration of journey or journey of mine is essentially two-pronged. So one is historical, where I comb through archives, plant-based collections, historical literature. I have chats with archaeobotanists, landscape historians, farmers, and others. And I also visit places where Pilus was formerly cultivated. And then in the other side, I engage in revitalization. So that's mostly growing trials in collaboration with farmers and community groups. But I also engage with the wider movement around the diversification and decommoditization of grains, as well as collaborating with scientists and comparing what I'm doing with other examples of revitalization. Because plants have multiple and sometimes uncertain local names, you can use their scientific name usually as a more accurate way of finding information relating to them, particularly if you want to try and understand them botanically. So I started researching Avena nuda, which in Latin literally means naked oat. That was the name that I found alongside Pilus in various historical accounts. And a naked grain is essentially one that isn't encased in a hardened hull, so it can be threshed from the sheaf, either by hand or with much lighter tools. But as I started doing this, I came across some quite conflicting information. So there were a lot of scientific papers on Avena nuda, mostly around its biochemistry and nutritional potential, but they were mostly by Chinese researchers, and quite a lot of them were claiming that the crop had originated in China. In fact, in Inner Mongolia, there's an annual naked oat noodles festival, which showcases the culinary diversity of an ingredient that they hail to be a traditional local food. So this naked oat, it seems, actually arrived in Europe in the early 1800s. And when it did, it made quite a splash. So there's quite a lot of newspaper articles about it at the time, reporting on it. And I'm just going to read an extract from one of them to you now. It sort of shows how much hype there was around it. So the skinless oat is the most valuable crop ever produced in this empire. It was grown in the season of 1830 by Thomas de Renzi, who was a nobleman in County Wexford, Ireland, who obtained seed through a friend of his at Rotterdam, whither it was imported from Shantung, a remote district in China, and was quite unknown to Europeans till within these 3 years. The advantages which this extraordinary and valuable grain possesses over all other kinds of oats are numerous. So I digested that information and then had to wonder, was Pilus actually originally from the East? But then I came across this one in the Kerry Evening Post from 1830 saying, the pretended Chinese oats now selling in the county Wexford is ascertained to be no other than the pilcorn, common in the remote parts of the county Kerry, which is usually grown where no other description of grain will thrive. So eventually the penny dropped. There were two kinds of naked oats, in fact, which had become taxonomically confused. So one is Pilus, also known as pilcorn. It's much smaller grained, and it's closely related to, if not simply a naked version of the oat species Avena strigosa. And then you have the large or common naked oat with its center of diversity in China and Mongolia, which is a naked version of the common oat or Avena sativa, and that has substantially larger grains. So essentially, they both evolved in parallel, but on opposite sides of the globe, and ended up taking on quite a similar form. So they both have these thin, papery husks rather than hardened hulls like regular domesticated oats. And the name Avena nuda was originally assigned by Linnaeus to Pilus, but because its cultivation was already by that time confined to very remote regions, and then the Chinese naked oat arrived in Britain and Ireland, it then got co-opted for that type. And so our local naked oat was mostly forgotten about. In fact, it turned out that the seeds we'd been growing for the past few years and sharing with friends as this lost Cornish grain weren't actually Pilus, but in fact the large naked oat mistakenly sent to Jan in the late 1980s by the Welsh plant breeding station, who presumed that they were the same type. When I first found out about this, my heart sank, and I just thought, okay, maybe Pilus has gone extinct and the large naked oat is going to be all I can get my hands on. But now that I was better clued up on the distinction between the two, I was actually able to go back to the seed banks and ask for the right stuff. And it had actually survived. So in 2021, I raised 21 small naked oat accessions from seed banks in the UK, France, Germany, Italy, and even Canada. Raised them first in seedling trays and then planted them out in this quite elaborate rabbit and bird proof tunnel that you see me crouched in there. That really was a painstaking process, and I kind of laugh when I look back on it now, but I received such tiny little handfuls of seed from the seed banks that I just felt like I had to take every measure to stop them being lost to frost or pests. And it wasn't really clear from the names of the seeds that I received how many varieties or land races the material represented, so I kept them all separate, but I did suspect many of them to be duplicates that had basically just been swapped between seed banks over the various years. I also began delving deeper into the history of Pilus in Cornwall. So herbarium specimens are an incredible resource for exploring the history both of wild and cultivated plants. And this one here, which I get really, really excited about, is such a valuable piece of physical evidence. So it was collected by these two naturalists, Ray and Willoughby, on a visit to Land's End in 1667. And I was just really astonished to find it. Not only because the pressing and preserving of plants for scientific study was still quite a niche pursuit in the 17th century, and not that many specimens were even made in that era or survive, but because it's one of the very few in Willoughby's herbarium that he actually annotated with a collection location. So Pilus, Land's End, herbarium specimen from the 1600s is just like gold dust. And also as an accompaniment to it, in Ray's famous Historia Plantarum, he actually describes Pilus as being widely cultivated in Cornwall and as being sold as a price no less than that of wheat. So it really was a valued grain at the time. More compelling evidence for the historical significance of Pilus to the Cornish landscape comes in the form of field names. So in 1990, the Cornish historian and linguist Peter Poole wrote a book discussing the field names of West Penwith. And West Penwith, for those of you who don't know, is that bulge on the far left-hand side, that headland there where most of the points are clustered. Paul's book was based mostly on records from the 1840s tithe maps, but also some from the 1695 Land Hydrock Atlas. And Paul showed that quite a number of fields were actually named after Pilus, and that the word had mutated over time to become Pellus, Pilles, Pillars, and even Pillows and Billows. And I've since expanded on Paul's work by basically going through those records for the entirety of Cornwall and then creating this map. And it's my theory that in earlier centuries, Pilus would actually have been cultivated across the whole region, but it's the combination of perhaps soil type plus social factors like the receding gradient of Cornishness over time that actually sees most of the points at that snapshot in time concentrated in the far southwest. And it's worth noticing that West Penwith wasn't only the last stronghold of Pilus, but also the last stronghold of the Cornish language. But it's from this guy, who is the Cornish naturalist and antiquarian William Borlase, who lived in West Penwith, who I'm a massive fan of, that we perhaps learn the most about the uses and value of Pilus. So Borlase wrote a series of letters to his friend Charles Littleton, who was also an antiquarian based in Worcester at the time. And in them, Borlase describes Pilus in quite a lot of detail. And he even at one point sends 8 gallons of seed on a ship to Littleton for experimental use in agricultural improvement. So I'm just going to read a couple of the things that he wrote about Pilus during the mid-1700s. Borlase says, "In the coarsest land, such as have had potatoes, etc., we have the larger, fuller grain, generally speaking. If it's sown in fat land, the stalk will grow flaggy and weak, go to lie and be fit only for manure, and the grain will be very slight and not kerned." So here he's saying something quite important, which is that in poor nutrient soil, Pilus does really well, but in fertile soil, it will actually just grow up and potentially fall over or lodge. "The straw of Pilus," he says, "makes a tougher, neater rope for thatching than the reed of other grains. The grain is small, a multitude goes to a bushel. It has no bran, yields as much meal as wheat, and is therefore intrinsically worth as much." He says Pilus gerts, and gerts is the Cornish word for oatmeal, are much preferred because of their superior sweetness, best for feeding pigs of any grain whatsoever. 1 bushel of Pilus will do the service of 2 of barley and make better flesh, very useful for rearing calves after weaning. In the sheaf, it is very nourishing for stored cattle. And then another Cornish intellectual who took quite a shine to Pilus is the 19th century folk storyteller William Bottrell, who also lived in West Penwith. Bottrell wrote of Pilus, "It is a great pity that the cultivation of this hardy grain, which will flourish on almost any dry, poor soil, should be neglected. Anyone who's ever made a hearty breakfast on milk thickened with parched Pilus groats will say that it is far superior to rice, or to many of the other duty-paid farinaceous matters with strange names that we get from abroad." But it seems Bottrell's writings were actually based on local people's memories of Pilus rather than his own first-hand encounter with it. As this 1879 extract from the Cornish newspaper suggests, Pilus has died out in Cornwall as food product and plant. That from one of the parishes where there was a faint chance of its lingering, Zena, someone has sent our friend, Mr. Bottrell, what the discoverer thought might be a bit of Pilus growing wild. It turns out, however, to be darnel. But 50 years on, the Cornish revival movement actually rekindled intellectual interest in it once again. So in 1924, the Federation of Old Cornwall Societies was established with the aim of collecting and maintaining all those ancient things that make the spirit of Cornwall, its traditions, its old words and ways, and what remains to it of its Celtic nationality. And the Society's motto, and it should be said that the societies do still exist, is "Gather ye fragments that are left, that nothing be lost." So in the spirit of gathering these fragments, co-founder of the movement, Robert Morton Nance, actually wrote a piece about Pilus in the Society's journal in 1930. where he described it as a grain unique to Cornwall and Brittany that had gone extinct the previous century. Only a few years later, though, another article appeared in the journal by William Watson, who was head gardener at Morab Gardens in Penzance. And Watson described how, although they'd so far only known of pilus as a grain that their forefathers grew plentifully, and that something that older men remembered eating, he'd been delighted to have found it listed for purchase in a French seed catalogue under the name Avoine Nu Grosse. There's no doubt that Avoine Nu is Avena nuda and therefore pilus, he wrote. So I sent for some seed and grew it in the nursery attached to Morab Gardens. And here's the original receipt from the French seed firm, Villemorine Andrew, recently donated to Morab Archive by Watson's granddaughter, Sue, who I believe has joined us here tonight, who I've recently had the pleasure of reconnecting with. And 1932 saw Cornwall host the Celtic Congress for the first time, where Watson wrote he gave away some ears to a number of people, hoping it to be cultivated by his Celtic cousins. Pilus has now similarly spread into several districts of Cornwall and is in the hands of so many keen old Cornwall members that it will not be extinct again in our time. And there's this wonderful picture of Watson in the 1930s there, holding a sheaf of the naked oats that he cultivated. Watson's efforts, however, were undermined by the same case of mistaken identity that I was met with at the beginning of my research and that many other people have come up against. So in this extract from a 19th century agricultural encyclopedia, Villemorine of the Parisian seed firm actually describes both the small and the large naked oat types side by side. So I think it's very likely, unfortunately, that the naked Avoine Nu Grosse seed that he purchased wasn't pilus after all. I've also been building a wider picture of the significance of this grain elsewhere. So there are actually quite a few records and descriptions of its cultivation in England, with pilcorn mentioned in manorial records from the 14th century, and the crop also traceable in field and place names in Sussex, Gloucestershire, Leicestershire, Cheshire and Staffordshire, and probably all loads of other shares that I haven't actually looked at yet. And it also appears in Gerard's famous 1597 herbal, where it's described as growing in Norfolk and Suffolk, as well as in the Natural History of Staffordshire, which was published in the late 1600s. By the 1700s, though, it seems that it might be gone or almost gone from England because there's hardly any records of it at all. And by the early 19th century, it's described as only valued as a curious variety in collections. So that's a quote from the 1836 Agriculturalist Manual. And I think it's really interesting to consider that something could be merely a curiosity in England at that time, whilst simultaneously still being strongly cultivated in parts of Cornwall and also apparently Ireland. So I had a feeling. I'd read in a few places that it might have had a history in Ireland. So last October I took my oat journey there. I came over on the ferry from South Wales to Wexford, and then I spent a few actually amazing weeks driving around there, visiting people involved with oats and heritage grains in general, as well as archives and libraries and plant collections. And there's nothing like, unfortunately, the amount and richness of evidence from Cornwall for the cultivation of pilus there, but there are a couple of nuggets that do suggest it was once a traditional crop in Ireland. So in the mid-18th century, the English traveller Richard Pocock reported seeing pilcorn, a sort of oats that boil without grinding like rice for eating and have no husk, in Baltimore, while the priest and geographer Beaufort, who mapped Ireland in the 18th century, wrote that the Aran Islands produce a small kind of oats without any husk. And according to Herbert Hunter, an agricultural botanist, it was still being cultivated under the name pilcorn in County Kerry and County Galway well into the 1930s. So I came back on the ferry via the Dublin to Liverpool route and continue my oat quest road trip in Wales, where I'd found a particularly high concentration of mentions of pilcorn in digitised records. So I was really keen to learn more about its history there, and I spent 3 weeks then driving around, seeing undigitized stuff in the archives and also connecting with various people and projects, including the incredible Gaia Foundation's project Llaverni, Our Grains. Those guys are working with Welsh heritage oats, and they happen to be holding an oat-based celebration and feast at that time at Gerald Miles's farm in Pembrokeshire, which was a really great event to be able to attend. Unfortunately, that part of the trip was kind of frustrating and left me with more questions than answers. So there are dozens, if not hundreds of accounts from Wales mentioning pilcorn, but where that word is defined, it is said to describe a threshed or dehulled grain. So it could be oats, wheats or barley that have been processed and not necessarily a crop in its own right. Although there is a herbarium specimen collected on the Isle of Anglesey during the 1700s. So it could be that it was cultivated there under a different name, or that perhaps pilcorn had a double meaning. It was also grown in northern France under the name Pilat, particularly strongly in Brittany, which, as you'll probably know, shares historical cultural ties with Cornwall and Wales. And Cambry described seeing it during his journey around Finisterre in the late 1700s. There are also herbarium specimens from the region, and it appears in an old Breton rhyme. Another dimension of my research has been collaborating with scientists to discover and describe the physical characteristics of Pilus, both comparing them with other oats and also between the various accessions that have been maintained in seed banks. So at IBERS at the University of Aberystwyth, Fiona Cork has been growing the 21 accessions that I got out of seed banks a few years ago in the very high-tech greenhouse there, which basically the plants go around on this amazing, almost like sushi style conveyor belt, and they get administered at different points, certain measures of light and moisture, and they can get image. So it's the coolest facility. At the same time as which, Catherine Howarth has been leading studies looking at the genetic variation both within and between them, as well as their nutritional content, and preliminary findings from that study show that it has quite high levels of protein. Oliver Stevens, whose interest in Pilus was piqued by historical reports of it doing particularly well in low nutrient soil, has compared it in a study looking at its rooting capacity against other oats. So Pilus's roots he found have, they build up much more biomass than the other oats. And interestingly, as you can see in the picture, where the top is Pilus in high nutrient soil and the low is Pilus in low nutrient soil, in the lower nutrient, it builds up even more root biomass still, and they really go exploring. So that prompted us to think that maybe aside from just thinking of Pilus in terms of its potential as a grain cereal, we could also think about it as a low or no input carbon sequestering cover crop. So back to the revitalization part. After the 2021 harvest, even though about half of it was actually eaten by rodents just before I got there with my sickle, which was so annoying, I did actually save and bulk up enough to begin some larger scale experiments. So in 2022, we grew it in 3 different spots. Firstly, at Gothelny Farm in Somerset, where this guy, the amazing Fred Price, who's worked quite a lot with heritage grains as well as populations, planted each individual accession out in trial plots, and it grew really successfully there. And I was able to use his mini thresher in the barn to process the grain, which was a bit of a godsend. And I've also been working with Will Radmore, who's a farmer based near Grampound in Cornwall, who grows heritage grains to produce really beautiful flour. Will had been interested in Pilus for some time and had began bulking up his own supply in 2020, so he was able to grow quite a big patch of it last year. And then the third site was Falmouth Food Co-op's community field in Penryn, where we planted Pilus alongside various other grains as part of Loveland Community Grains, a project that myself, Katie Bliss and Duncan Pearson began last year, exploring diverse and resilient food systems through community engagement with grains. And this is the part of the project that's, I guess, most akin to what you guys have been doing at Sheffield Wheat Experiments. So those of you who are involved in that project will definitely recognise these kind of hands-on activities. So loads of people got involved in planting, tending to, harvesting, and most of all threshing the grain. And because it was such a success, we will be continuing that project again this year. The 2022 harvest yielded 5 kilograms of seed, which is enabling me to be a bit more ambitious with it this year. So I've recently partnered with Cornwall Wildlife Trust to collaborate with a couple of farmers and growers in West Penwith to trial Pilus on their land. And so that's 5 of them in 100 metre square plots. So I'm really interested to see both how Pilus does at this scale in a place where it was such a cultural stronghold of Pilus, as well as how those farmers and growers experience working with the grain. And I've also shared with growers in various other places, so it'd be great to see how they get along. To wrap up here, I'd like to share a few of my reflections on Pilus and on this journey and what I've so far learned from it. So both biocultural and personal reflections. I feel really indebted to those Cornish intellectuals who in so many ways were ahead of their time in recognising the uniqueness of Pilus and making the case for conserving it. So sometimes we think of crop conservation as, I guess, like a new age thing, something that we're only just becoming conscious of, but clearly it's actually been going on for quite a while. And their interest in Pilus is a reminder that we're not the first people to be motivated by the loss of tradition. So anxiety over disappearing traditions and customs was actually a really pervasive theme in the interwar years in places particularly that had undergone intense urbanization and industrialization over the previous centuries. And I think even Borlase was feeling that to an extent in the 1700s. Present day revitalisation projects are often not without historic precedent, and other examples from the past can be looked to from which to draw insights and learn lessons. So one lesson I think could be that cultural identity is a very strong motivating force for the revitalisation of neglected crops, and that's amazing. But I think that it should be exercised with caution, because over-romanticisation and a feeling of cultural exceptionalism, I think, can also muddy the water. So in the case of the old Cornwall movement, it definitely kept interest in Pilus alive, but it also overlooked the botanical inauthenticity of the seed that they were planting, as well as its wider significance in other parts of Britain and Ireland. Having said that, I also think that getting too hung up on biocultural authenticity could actually stall process on revitalisation work that, amid so much biocultural diversity loss, is becoming an extremely urgent task. So essentially, the large naked oat, I believe, actually served as kind of like a biological substitute or a proxy for Pilus at a time when that seed was actually really difficult to source. So you could actually argue that the large naked oat, even though it came from China, even though it wasn't the real thing, did actually facilitate the cultural revitalisation project that was the old Cornwall movement, as well as keeping knowledge about Pilus alive in its absence. And so at first, that whole mix up with the large naked oat felt like such a hindrance to my research. I was really frustrated by it. But now I've actually kind of reframed it, and it actually feels a bit more like it opens inspiration for the various different ways in which Pilus could be reinvented, because I think that reinvention is basically essentially what we need to do with Pilus in order for it to re-find a place in the food system today. So with the large naked oak, for example, hodmedods are doing a really good job of kind of getting the British public to reimagine oats as a locally grown alternative to rice, which kind of opens up scope for more diversity in the field and also on plates. It's been so powerful combining my two strands of research. So the growing part lends so much physicality to what, when looking over historical evidence, would otherwise be left mostly to the imagination. And then in turn, the historical research offers so many insights for the cultivation side of things. So I can say, yes, I see how it would have made a tougher, neater thatching rope than the straw of other grains. And also I can see how it does so much better on poorer soil. But I can also imagine why it might have been abandoned. You know, its grains really are absolutely tiny. 1,000 grains, by the way, weigh just 7.5 grams. But from just one of the sites, Loveland Community Field, we harvested 4 kilograms from having planted just over 100 grams, which is a 40-fold increase. And I kind of draw a conclusion from that, that maybe Pilus is wanting to make a comeback. So just to end here, although I coaxed Pilus out of the seed bank, all along the way, this has definitely felt like a journey in which Pilus has been leading the way, at least just as much as, or if not more so than myself. So Pilus has led me all over Britain and Ireland. It's also led me to making connections with people all over the world. But most profoundly, it has led me home. And I often feel as this journey progresses, like there are more questions than answers. But as a lost crop, it's always going to be enigmatic, and that is part of its draw. So I decided in this last slide to rename this talk retrospectively, not Journey for a Lost Oat, but Journey with a Lost Oat. And with that, I would like to thank Sheffield Wheat Experiment for the invitation to share this journey with you. Also my many research collaborators, my granddad and Pilus. And there are my contact details in case you want to get in touch later or follow my research journey virtually on social media. And hopefully now we've got time for a few questions.
Thank you so much, Harriet. That was just so interesting. And I was really struck by an image quite early on of the grains that you had managed to retrieve and how few they were, and how like being able to nurture it back into existence from that small amount of grains, it makes them feel so precious, and that each one actually holds all of that story. It's interesting to see, like, hear how you would go about retrieving that story. And like, yeah, when we look at all different grains and plants, particularly crops, which are so entwined with our identities, yeah, we can think about what they're sort of holding. But and also I liked your renaming of the renaming.
I thought, is this a bit rude to rename, because you came up with that name, which I absolutely loved, and then I thought, no, it can be a bit better.
And yeah, so we do have a bit of time. If does anyone have questions? I don't think any were put into the chat, but if you want to, you can in the little reactions button at the bottom of the screen, you can put your hand up and it will put you in a queue if you want to pose any questions. Toby?
Yeah, hi. Thanks, Harriet. Can you hear me okay?
We can hear you.
Yeah, thanks very much. That was a really great story, and I really enjoyed hearing it. I just wondered if in the course of your research, you had come across any archaeology relating to naked oats, and whether any of that related to Scandinavia or the Western Isles or the western side of Britain, just because I know in terms of other grains, that's been really important, you know, the Iceman, the grains that were found in his pouch, etc. So I just wondered whether you had come across anything, whether that was relevant.
Yeah, it's definitely relevant. Always when you're looking into crop histories like this, the archaeobotany, as it's called, is like a really important place to go. Does it exist in the archaeobotanical records? And currently it seems that Pilus doesn't exist in the archaeobotanical record, but that's not to say it hasn't been found in archaeological finds. It's just that it maybe hasn't been identified yet. So it's a really, really understudied and little known crop. So I think almost every archaeobotanist I spoke to, even if they literally specialized in oats in Britain, really had either never heard of it or had hardly heard anything about it. But one thing that actually makes it quite challenging to identify is that basically when you're trying to tell Pilus apart botanically from another oat, and you've got the plant in front of you, you use parts of the plant that actually wouldn't really survive archaeologically. So archaeologically, usually cereals, you're able to look at them in that record because they've been charred. And but if a naked oat is charred, it basically gets rid of like all the evidence that says this is a naked oat. So you're kind of a bit of a catch-22 situation, but there is a possibility that maybe with some like very detailed kind of like study of the shape of the grains themselves, and then you might still be able to identify it. Essentially, it hasn't been on archaeologists' radars until this point, although I'm doing, I hope, quite a good job of trying to like spread the word. In terms of Scandinavia, I can't really speak to that, unfortunately. But yes, yeah, definitely a very valid question.
Thanks.
Holly, did you want? There is a few questions in the chat as well now, but I will let the people with hands up.
Hi, Harriet. I'm Cornish too, so it's nice to meet another Cornish woman here. I'm growing wheat for the third year here in Sheffield, and I'd really like to grow some oats. And there's a guy called Chris who's I'm going to get some from, who's part of the wheat experiment. But if I could grow some Pilus here, that would be really exciting. Is that possible?
Yes, it's possible. Yeah. I can absolutely send you some seed. A little goes a really long way with Pilus, as I've learned over the last few years. So I'd be very happy if you send me an email. Yeah, then I can absolutely send you some seed.
Thank you.
And Sue? Your computer is muted.
I just wanted to say hello, Harriet, because we've corresponded. And I wanted to say this. I'm sorry about everybody who's interested in wheat and so on. I wanted to say thank you for contributing to my efforts to contribute to the preservation of my grandfather's heritage. I'm terribly sad to hear that actually all the work he put into growing avoine new was probably not Pilus after all. But you have enriched another strand, which is about family history. It's about the history of West Cornwall. And it's also lovely to see some other Cornish maids here. You know, we've got to stick together, haven't we? So I just want to say hello properly and thank you very much for what you're doing. And this is intriguing. I had no idea. Welcome.
It's so nice to meet you, Sue. Yeah, so this is the granddaughter of William Watson. And it wasn't, I think I'm to say about 98% sure that it wasn't pillars he was growing. I mean, even in that black and white photo, like I can see that the sheaf, it looks like it is the large naked oak. But as I kind of explain in the reflections towards the end, like I think that he did an amazing job of keeping the interest in pillars and also the ethnobotanical knowledge of it alive at a time when, like, you couldn't really get hold of pillar seed. So actually, like, his efforts were definitely not in vain. Definitely not in vain. And I think there's probably a bit more to find out about that story. So we'll keep digging.
That is I found an interesting little corner of it. You remember the first thing I sent you was something which was post-war in the correspondence with the seed merchants in Paris. And they said at that time they couldn't supply him because it was forbidden to export seeds. 20 years later, they had sent him the seeds. So I think that's an interesting thread in what you're doing about the way that international regulations can actually hinder attempts to do just what you're attempting to do.
Actually, that's a really good point, because I think I got in there just in time for ordering my seed. So it was like just before they kind of got like a lot stricter on seed import regs, and I just managed to get the seed sent over from Canada and from various other places, like just in time to plant them for the 2021 springtime. So if it had been maybe like the following year, I think I would have really struggled to get the seed in time, because everything's taking so long to get it over the border now. But yeah, I find it really interesting how so many aspects of the journey that I experience now, and that kind of feeling of like anxiety over disappearing traditions and things like that. And you just think these are all completely contemporary issues, and they are, but actually like they've happened before.
Yes, because I think that for him this was part of his, as you know, he was a founder member of the Cornish Gorset, and it was part of that led him into wanting to conserve something that he saw as part of his culture, of the Cornish traditions and culture, which had been eroded so badly, and which he and people like Morton Nance were trying to retrieve. So it's a very complicated layers of things. So it's not just about the biological side in which you're an expert, but you're quite right. It's about conservation of cultural threads. Yeah. Anyway, lovely to see your face. Thank you very much. Take care. Bye-bye.
Thank you, Sue. There's a couple of questions in the chat which maybe we can just very quickly answer. Marnie asks, does Pillas store better than the large naked oat?
I don't know the answer to that question. So but what this is relating to is that
but
the large, I think, yeah, okay. The large naked oat, so people are really excited about naked oats in general, and the large naked oat's amazing because it's just like a bigger version of Pillas basically, but it's got a really high oil content, which is one of the reasons that it's really interesting as well, because it's very nourishing. But it also means that when it's stored in kind of like big piles, it's supposed to kind of like the weight of it can the seeds can kind of like start breaking down and the oils can come out, so it can kind of go rancid quite quick. I don't know if that's the same with Pillas, because I have never seen a large enough quantity of it to know. But yeah, it remains to be seen. I'm not exactly sure. There's something else about the large naked oat. The seeds, when they're processed, they kind of have these like micro hairs on them. So when they go through the machinery, they all get up in the air, and then farmers often complain that it can kind of like give them sore throat. And Pillas does have less hairs on the surface, not completely hairless, naked, but it could be that in that sense they are a bit easier to work with.
Cool. And there was another question, the last one, Lawrence, sort of asking for the origin story of this origin story, and as to how you got into this area of academia.
What's the question? How did I get into this area of academia?
Yeah, I've lost the question now, so that was from my memory. Oh, there it is. Yeah, so interested to learn of your journey into this area of academia. Did you do specific undergrad or masters?
Oh yeah, okay. Well, I guess it came about because I realized that I just absolutely loved food and needed to know much more about how it was produced. So my route into ethnobotany actually came through me studying agricultural, more specifically agricultural development, which I actually studied in Copenhagen. And when I was there was actually a course on the program which was ethnobotany, and my tutor who was teaching that was really into Andean roots and tubers. So he basically got me onto the research in Peru. And then that's, as you kind of like had a bit, pretty much the story from there. Yeah, so it's through that route. But I did also do an ethnobotany masters, which you can do at the University of Kent. So that is like a place which has a specialism in ethnobotany, but you can basically study ethnobotany under different titles in loads of different places. As long as your project is around people and plants, then you know, essentially you are doing ethnobotany to an extent. So yeah, it doesn't necessarily have to be there.
Okay, nice. And actually there has been one more question, which we will make the last one because we're running slightly over, but I do like this question. William asked whether you can speak to pilus in the context of cookery. Has there been a concurrent revival of interest in using it as an ingredient? Have you encountered or eaten pilus in any form in your travels around the UK and particular regional uses?
So basically, because my main focus has been on bulking up seed, I've resisted, other than literally nibbling like individual seeds, I've still not actually sat down and eaten pilus, because every seed is so precious and it just needs to go into the next year's planting. But after this year's harvest, there should be enough to actually go wild with the feasting and cookery and trying out different things. So what I would love to do is to try out the recipe of pilus gurts, so just the oatmeal porridge, but there is actually a very particular way in which that's described as being prepared in one of Bottrell's folk stories. So the grains are basically put on a damp cloth and then they actually sprout. And just as they start to sprout, they're taken off and then they're roasted in a pan over a fire. So I think actually if they sprout and then they're roasted, they probably have a bit of like a malted taste. And then also as they're described as being a particularly sweet oat. So then they're ground up in like a granite trough with apparently a pebble picked up from the seashore. It might just be a sort of narrative flair, but that's what you're saying people did. And then they are cooked up with milk and I think half milk and half water. So I'd really like to try that because that's a specific recipe. And then other than that, I welcome experiments. The other thing I'd like to try, inspired by the festival in Inner Mongolia, is naked oat noodles.
Yeah, I think we have had a similar experience with the wheat experiment of building up, and yeah, it's exciting to but yeah, so I think that's all the questions, and yeah, just thank you so much again, Harriet, and thanks to everyone for coming and all your questions.
Thank you so much.